symposium of the new year. Clearly, we are in a transition period, and it is my fervent hope and intention that the end of this year will be far better, calmer, and moving in a positive direction than the beginning of this year, which is really in a horrific situation. And what I'd like to do is just address a couple of matters, and then Robert Castle, who was working on my campaign, has some things to discuss regarding the Kennedy assassination, the implications of that for the United States and for today. First of all, people may or may not be aware that South Africa brought a case against Israel for genocide at the International Court of Justice. And they have an 84-page document, which one of my colleagues has read, which is really devastating. The point is made that genocide is defined in the 1948 Convention on Genocide as killings, quote, committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, unquote. And they say that Israel's actions, quote, are genocidal in character because they are intended to bring about the destruction of a substantial part, unquote, of the Palestinian population of Gaza. As of December 29th, which was a week ago, they had killed more than 21,100 Palestinians. That is Palestinians with names identified. There were close to 8,000 others missing. That is people buried under the rubble who have not been able to be identified. The death toll now is probably over 30,000 named, I would guess, and I don't know how many thousands not named. Plus, last I heard, there were over 300,000 people in Gaza suffering from respiratory illnesses, other illness, which is what you would expect when people don't have access to fuel, clean water, food, antibiotics, anesthesia, etc. So that's the situation. Now, everyone in the world knows that President Biden could pick up the telephone, call Bibi Netanyahu, and order a halt to this and order humanitarian aid to be brought in under conditions of a ceasefire, which should be permanent and should lead to negotiations for a peace agreement, which emphatically will include the recognition of a sovereign Palestinian state as well as an Israeli state. There is someone in prison in Israel right now, a very, very important Palestinian scholar, really a student of peace, named Marwan Barghouti, who was involved in the 1993 Oslo Accords. He has been in prison for over 20 years. He has now learned Hebrew fluently. He is fluent in English and, of course, Arabic. And because of his very, I would say, enlightened philosophical approach to this, may be the key person to creating a pathway to peace. And the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, Jacques Cheminade of Solidarité et Progrès in France, and I myself are calling for his immediate release. Now, I wanted to just share something which I've been talking about quite a bit over the last days, which is a paper written by Lyndon LaRouche, which I think is very important for this moment. It's called How Bertrand Russell Became an Evil Man. And the prologue of the paper takes the question of a child, how does a child become a genius? This question of why, and Leibniz really addressed this. Why is something one way and not otherwise? Why why must it be so and not otherwise? And he says then, begin by choosing an important single event from history choose any such event in which there is evidence that the event was motivated by aid of some widely accepted but fraudulent pretext. Seek to discover what motivated that fraud and seek to uncover also the reasons that fraud was tolerated by its dupes. So the case that he is looking at is why the United States chose to drop not one, which would have been bad enough, but two thermonuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, large civilian populations in Japan, killing hundreds of thousands of people when Japan was already negotiating a surrender. Helga Zepp-LaRouche talks about the why that she asked, which was how is it that Germany, the nation which produced Schiller, Beethoven, Leibniz, could be the nation which also produced Adolf Hitler? How could that occur? Very important. Today, tens of thousands, perhaps millions of young Americans are asking why? Why? How could it be that the United States, the nation which claimed at one point to be a beacon of hope, a temple of liberty, to have in our Declaration of Independence the idea that every human being is created equal, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, the first of which is life. How is it that our nation could be engaged in perpetrating such a monstrous crime as we see unfolding in Gaza before the eyes of the world? And that, I think, this topic of the Kennedy assassination gets at. Now, I just want to bring up a couple of matters. I rewatched an interview of Jeff Steinberg with Fletcher Prouty, a LaRouche Executive Intelligence Review interview. Fletcher Prouty was known as Mr. X in the film JFK, a high-level intelligence officer who described, actually going back to World War II, the beginning of the so-called Cold War. And he described literally on September 2nd, 1945, the nuclear bombs. The first one was dropped August 6th, the second one 3 days later. Japan had surrendered. General Douglas MacArthur accepted their surrender on the battleship Missouri, September 2nd. Prouty was there and saw that there was some massive amount, $500 million in those days was quite a lot, worth of weaponry that was being shipped to Japan. And he asked someone, what are you going to do with all these weapons? Are we going to send them all back? Wouldn't that be? And they said, oh, no, of course not. Half of the weapons are going to Hanoi, Vietnam. Half of the weapons are going to Seoul. So already preparations for the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And then he described how it was that the Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh, who had been our ally, was able to surprise the French because he had American weapons, but then the US switched sides and backed the French against Ho Chi Minh. The French ultimately were defeated, but that became later the Vietnam War. He also described at a point during the war, 700 prisoners of war from the Nazis were taken by train through Turkey into northern Syria, put on airplanes and flown, I guess, into Egypt. And Prouty happened to be on one of the planes. And he said he got to the back of the plane and there were several people in there who were not Americans. They were Romanians and they were Nazis. They were pro-Nazi and they were intelligence officers and they had intelligence on the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union was our ally in defeating fascism. They lost 27 million people in that war fighting Hitler. Hitler would not have been defeated but for that incredible sacrifice that they made. But already people were preparing for some kind of conflict with the Soviet Union, literally over FDR's dead body. And it was the view of Lyndon LaRouche that the British in particular prolonged the war to ensure that Franklin Roosevelt would be dead by the time it ended, because his policy was that the colonial powers should give up their colonies and allow them to have their full independence. He said, we're not fighting against Nazi fascism to allow 18th century methods to prevail. And Churchill got red in the face and, what do you mean by that? And FDR said, anything which extracts the wealth and labor of a nation and gives it nothing in consideration. And Churchill said that would be the end of the British Empire. He had no intention of allowing that to happen. So the war dragged on until FDR was out of the way and the little nasty Anglophile Truman came in, who was willing to drop the nuclear bombs on Japan. So this was already underway. Kennedy came in, and Prouty said more about the various details and the perfidy of McGeorge Bundy and Allen Dulles in what became the Bay of Pigs, the disaster, the first thing to befall Kennedy. And he, as has been said numerous times by Robert F. Kennedy, his nephew, Jr., said that he wanted to shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces, and he moved to put covert operations under the Joint Chiefs of Staff, actually. But I will stop there. But I think it's very important to reflect on how did the nation, which led the first successful revolution against the British Empire, against colonialism, become now the nation which is enforcing, supporting, supplying genocidal wars of aggression, fascist wars of aggression around the planet. And with that, I will introduce Robert Castle, who I hope will shed some light on this. Go ahead, Robert.
Hi. Okay. Well, that was an excellent introduction to my presentation, and I'm glad that you were going through some of those details, because a lot of that is frankly not going to be covered in my presentation. But it is obviously very important to have that historical overview, and that is obviously the purpose of talking about the Kennedy assassination. Can we get the, okay. Well, that's something.
The reenactment of Washington crossing the Delaware.
Yeah. So this is the author of the book that I'm presenting on, James Douglas. I thought you might like to see what he looks like. He's quite old at this time. He's about 80 years old. When I finished his book, I sent him an email. I said, wow, this book really changed the whole way that I think about my life. And he sent me an email back. He said, well, I'm so glad you're reading my book. And he sent me a copy of his book on Gandhi. So he's kind of just a regular guy. But he has a really incredible approach to history. And that's kind of what I want to talk about tonight, is his particular approach to history, and the manner in which he tries to address the reality of the assassination of Kennedy as a historical fact that we all have to deal with. So I have some notes here. I'm going to read from them. I'm not going to prove anything about Kennedy's assassination in the form of like a geometrical proof in a class. In other words, Douglas has a theory. He has an account of what happened, and it's quite comprehensive and very well studied. But I'm not going to, there's no way you can communicate a 600-page book in an hour-long conversation, obviously. But so my purpose is to convince you, hopefully, of the importance of engaging with these questions. That's not to say that you don't need an exhaustive kind of evidentiary proceeding. That does need to happen, and as long as the government continues to withhold the remainder of the documents that it does, that's obviously impossible in the fullest sense. So that's obviously, it's critical that happens, and it's an insult to all American citizens, and it's also, pretty obvious, telling fact that they haven't released them yet. But I say he does succeed in giving an account of the role of the intelligence agencies in Kennedy's murder. And the question is, how does he do that? And my argument is basically that he has a very specific philosophical approach to the question of what historical truth is. And the main thing that distinguishes his book is that he, as a Catholic and as an anti-war activist and as an activist particularly against the use of nuclear weapons, he sort of approaches the question through this Catholic perspective with regard to the salvation of Kennedy's soul as somebody who was on the brink of causing a nuclear holocaust during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's the sort of the major turning point in the book for Douglas. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. The facts around the assassination slowly enter the public domain, it becomes increasingly common knowledge that the factual account of the Warren Commission, it was full of actual impossibilities and absurdities. Most memorably, the description of the path of the so-called magic bullet that supposedly turned in midair several times, wounding multiple people along the way. So one of the main questions that I want to ask along the lines of what Diane was saying, the quote that Diane had about Lyndon LaRouche. What's that?
Just gotta mute Diane. Go on.
This question of why. Why is it that these lies in the Warren Commission could have become the official documentation? And I want to sort of approach this by thinking about the question of information as the question of what knowledge is. And does knowing something mean just having some certain information? Because if that's what knowing is, then if you have the so-called correct facts of the Warren Commission report, for example, someone says these are the correct facts, you have the information, you know what happened, and then that's how these kind of official lies could be put forward. And so part of my argument, and I think this is a big part of Douglas's book, is that you have to have a different idea of what it means to know something. We have the problem of the sort of ideological or dogmatic concept of knowing something, and that is how we have these lies become public narratives. And what I want to say about that is, even though the full release of the documents is unquestionably necessary, we cannot wait for an obviously corrupt government to give us the truth. The truth isn't something that can be given in the sense of them releasing the documents. My argument is that that's not what the truth is. That what the essential problem, as I understand it, is that people have to become personally invested in the process of discovering the truth. And particularly in the case of Kennedy, a truth that exceeds the sort of your individualized identity. And so in order to portray how that process is available to us, I think it's useful to look at how James Douglas uses an analogy to Dante's Divine Comedy in his book, because he quotes in his book that he says, Thomas Merton is my Virgil, and he has a concept of the book that he's going basically into hell in the process of discovering what actually happened to Kennedy, and the truth of the full account of the corruption and the cover-up. So you have, on the one hand, you have this idea of Dante following Virgil, who's the poet of reason, into hell, guided by divine love, and on the other hand, you have Douglas following his preferred Catholic mentor. And so part of the reason why I want to touch on that is because I think it's important to recognize that both Dante and Douglas have a poetic form that they use, which is a process of dialogue with themselves, essentially, but it's a poetic process where the dialogue is how the story unfolds. Dante follows Virgil, and he has these various conversations, and they talk about why people are in hell and the various forms of torture that they have and things like that. And in a similar way, Douglas goes through all of the many details of the case, and the whole time he's using this particular idea of the unspeakable from Thomas Merton to continue this dialogue. So the beginning of the process, as Dante had it, was the following piece of poetry that I'd like to read to give a sense of how he understood entering hell.
at this point in the story, Dante is about to enter the gates of hell. And he's looking at this gate, and he's already met Virgil, who has taken up the mantle to guide him through hell. So this is them, as you can see in the illustration, which will come up in just a second. In 1 second. In the illustration that we had up there, you can see, you could see, there we go.
Right.
You can see in the illustration here, it's two people, it's Virgil and Dante, and they're at the gate. And so now this, what I'm about to read, is the scene at which they're looking at the gate, and above the gate, this is what's written. Through me, the way is to the city dolent. Through me, the way is to eternal dole. Through me, the way among the people lost. Justice incited my sublime Creator, created me divine omnipotence, the highest wisdom and the primal love. Before me there were no created things, only etern, and I eternal last. All hope abandon, ye who enter in. These words in somber color I beheld, written upon the summit of a gate, whence I, their sense is, master, hard to me, and he to me as one experienced.
Here all suspicion needs must be abandoned, all cowardice must needs be here extinct. We to the place have come where I have told thee, thou shalt behold the people dolorous, who have foregone the good of intellect.
And after he had laid his hand on mine, with joyful mien whence I was comforted, he led me in among the secret things.
So the epigram of this book is this quote, and when I opened to this page, I was really struck by his choice to start the book this way, because you're essentially immediately in this dialogue with this character, John Kennedy, and you have a question posed from him to you about yourself and about him. So this is Douglas talking about his own method, particularly with regard to this idea of going into hell. My methodology is from Gandhi. This is an experiment in truth. Its particular truth is a journey into darkness. If we go as far as we can into the darkness, regardless of the consequences, I believe a midnight truth will set us free from our bondage to violence and bring us to the light of peace. And I'm going to skip ahead. The belief behind this book is that truth is the most powerful force on earth, what Gandhi called satyagraha, truth force or soul force. By his experiments in truth, Gandhi turned theology on its head by saying that truth itself is God. We all see, every individual sees a part of the truth and can seek it more deeply. And the other side of that process is compassion, our response to the suffering of others. In living out the truth, we are liberated from the unspeakable. And I will get in a minute to a definition of that, unspeakable. But before that, I just want to start with one case from the book, which I thought was particularly interesting with regard to this question of how, and this goes into, I was being a little bit vague when I was talking about this idea of what it means to know something, but I think that it becomes very concrete when we look at this proceeding from the Warren Commission, where you, to give the background a little bit, you have these doctors who were involved with the autopsy shortly after the president's body was taken to the hospital nearby where he was shot, and men with suits come in, and there's varying accounts of what actually happened, but basically the standard order as it was supposed to happen according to state law, I believe, was not followed, and there was strange things were afoot, and you can read the book. But my focus here is the questions that were asked of the doctor who performed the autopsy. Assuming that the bullet passed through the president's body, going in between the strap muscles of the shoulder without violating the pleural space, and exited at a point in the midline of the neck, would the hole which you saw on the president's throat be consistent with an exit point, assuming the factors which I have just given to you? And so Charles Crenshaw, one of these doctors, who was not testifying at this moment, but who was there at the proceedings, later pointed out, the question that was asked in that moment was essentially, if this were an exit wound, would that be an exit wound? And it was a clearly forceful question, because the official narrative that was intended to be put forward was that the bullets came from behind, because that's where that's the path the bullet would have had to have taken if it came from Lee Harvey Oswald, where he was said to have been, which is the official narrative that the Warren Commission upheld. So the doctors go along with this purely logical kind of, just informational kind of, almost like a calculation kind of concept of what knowing something is, and it in fact is, I think the book proves pretty conclusively a lie, along with many other things that are obviously lied about in public. But the point is, you look, the person who was involved with, I mean, Gerald Ford was on the Warren Commission along with Alan Dulles, many other people. Gerald Ford ended up becoming the president, and he's one of the people who's asking these very specifically leading kinds of questions. And so I'm just going to read something from Charles Crenshaw, because I think this is important to understand the significance of the continued ramifications. All the way into the 90s was when Crenshaw released his book called JFK, Conspiracy of Silence, about the doctors being forced to maintain a certain narrative. He says, in the 90s when he broke his silence, I believe there was a common denominator in all of this doctor's silences, a fearful perception that to come forward with what we believed to be the medical truth would be asking for trouble. Although we never admitted it to one another, we realized that the inertia of the established story was so powerful, so thoroughly presented, so adamantly accepted, that it would bury anyone who stood in its path. I was as afraid of the men in suits as I was of the men who had assassinated the president. I reasoned that anyone who would go so far as to eliminate the president would surely not hesitate to kill a doctor. And so what this last paragraph here points out is basically that he came out, he released this book, and he immediately had his public character assassinated. He was denounced by a prestigious journal, the Journal of American Medical Association, and this is from people that were involved in the Warren Commission. There was an attorney in the Warren Commission who was publicly calling to have Crenshaw have all of his finances exposed for what he did, because he was exposing the cover-up. So I started with that example to focus on that idea of what it means to know something, because that's the current throughout the whole presentation. But the title of this book is The Unspeakable, and Douglas gets this concept of the unspeakable from Thomas Merton. So I want to explain what that idea is, and at the same time try to acquaint you with the thesis of the book to a certain extent. So Kennedy, according to Douglas, obviously was not a saint. He's not trying to spin it in a religious way in that sense. He recognizes he's a historian, so he recognizes the factual record that Kennedy was essentially a cold warrior throughout the 50s. But the point that Douglas wants to make, that he argues for throughout the book, is that you can trace throughout the process of the Cuban Missile Crisis into Kennedy's decision to withdraw from Vietnam a religious turning. And he says that this comes out of the conflict that Kennedy enters with what he calls the unspeakable. The unspeakable is a term Thomas Merton coined at the heart of the 60s after JFK's assassination, in the midst of the escalating Vietnam War, the nuclear arms race, and further assassinations of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy. In each of these soul-shaking events, Merton sensed an evil whose depth and deceit seemed to go beyond the capacity of words to describe. One of the awful facts of our age, Merton wrote in 1965, is the evidence that the world is stricken indeed, stricken to the very core of its being by the presence of the unspeakable. The Vietnam War, the race to a global war, and the interlocking murders of the four mentioned above were all signs of the unspeakable. It remains deeply present in our world today, Douglas says about the present day. As Merton warned, those who are at present so eager to be reconciled with the world at any price must take care not to be reconciled with it under this particular aspect, as the nest of the unspeakable. This is what too few are willing to see. So this is essential to Douglas's point, and I know it maybe seems kind of vague or like I'm avoiding the factual details, but really the main point that I want to make is that what's important to me about Douglas's book is that he recognizes there's no way to compose the story of Kennedy's assassination without himself undergoing the spiritual process of recognizing what essentially amounts to hell, which is recognizing the actually hellish reality, the fully hellish reality of the slew of assassinations that happened in the 60s, which killed the moral leadership that the burgeoning civil rights movement and the young student movements that were occurring in the 60s that completely destroyed or largely destroyed the hope that was coming out and the sense of progress and the sense of moving towards the ideals of the U.S. Constitution. When that was destroyed, as he argues, through the Oswald cover-up and then this string of assassinations, that creates, arguably this is something that I think that Diane's campaign talks about a lot and that obviously Lyndon LaRouche was deeply involved with trying to work against, a very dark picture of the reality of what the United States represents versus what it could be or should be or really is in its essence. And so, yeah, Douglas takes it to a pretty extreme point in saying the unspeakable, he says the unspeakable is not far away. It's not somewhere out there identical with a government that became foreign to us. The emptiness of the void, the vacuum of responsibility and compassion is in ourselves. Our citizen denial provides the ground for the government's doctrine of plausible deniability. JFK's assassination is rooted in our denial of our nation's crimes in World War II that began the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. And I think that kind of ties in to what Diane was saying about Fletcher Prouty's recognition of the direct continuation between World War II and the Cold War with regard to the arms sales that were occurring. As the growing precedent to JFK's assassination by his own national security state, we U.S. citizens supported our government when it, or at least didn't sufficiently resist it, when it destroyed whole cities, Hamburg, Dresden, Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, when it protected our Cold War security by world-destructive weapons, when it carried out the covert murders of foreign leaders with so-called plausible deniability in a way that was obvious to critical observers. So the point is that Kennedy's story really is the story of the United States of America, and that it is that there is a direct continuation. And I guess maybe Diane didn't touch on this too much, but it is. So I can read this as well. But you have the continuation from World War II into the Cold War, but you also have the Cold War sort of transforming into the so-called War on Terror. And that's obviously directly connected to the situation that we have today with the United States involvement in the Middle East. But so he says the problem is that there's a continuation of a sort of an evil concept of what is necessary, what is true. We are told we can only be safe through the threat of escalating violence. Anything goes in a fight against evil, preemptive attacks, torture, undermining governments, assassinations, whatever it takes to gain the end of victory over an enemy portrayed as irredeemably evil. And so this idea that he wants to put forward is that you can certainly make a rational argument, a sort of geopolitical argument for the necessity of these kinds of things. People do it all the time. But the point is, if you look at the actual historical record of what was happening between the Soviets and Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, you see that you have the war cabinets on both sides are pushing for direct confrontation, sort of along the lines of the first strike idea that was put forward by Bertrand Russell. But Kennedy was actively developing a recognition of the need for dialogue with the very person who was supposed to be his enemy. And that's the essential argument of the book. So so I guess I'll just say that when I put this one here because when you look through Dante's Inferno, there's this constant process where Dante he keeps turning to Virgil and saying like, oh, I don't know, we should probably just go back. We don't need to keep going further and further into hell. And I was kind of imagining Douglas also writing this book, spending, dedicating years of his life building up the, piles of paper on his desk that's all just amounting to a picture that evil has largely come to rule the world, and trying to sort of imagine what that process actually would be for an author to actually choose to confront evil, not just in some kind of like, way of not just showing off in public or something that you're a good person, but dedicating years of your life to personally, spiritually undergoing that process. So I wanted to share one of the selections from the Inferno where you see that kind of dialogue happening.
Yeah, at this part, they're about like halfway through hell. They're at the sixth circle of hell. And they come to a roadblock, Virgil and Dante, because Dante's still alive. And all the people who are in hell kind of resent Dante for being alive and walking so plainly through the circles of hell. So these demons, which we're about to hear, basically tell Virgil, who's dead, you can come, but Dante has to go back. So this is where that starts. A little then they quelled their great disdain and said, come thou alone, and he begone who has so boldly entered these dominions. Let him return alone by his mad road. Try if he can, for thou shalt remain here. Who hast escorted him through such dark regions? Think, reader, if I was discomforted at utterance of the accursed words, for never to return here I believed. Oh, my dear guide, who more than 7 times has rendered me security and drawn me from imminent peril that before me stood, do not desert me, said I. I think this is you.
No, it's do not desert me, said I, thus undone.
Thus undone. And if the going farther be denied us, let us retrace our steps together swiftly. And that Lord, who had led me thitherward, said unto me,
Fear not, because our passage none can take from us, by such is it given. But here await me, and thy weary spirit comfort and nourish with a better hope, for in this nether world I will not leave thee. So, my idea in putting that there is that I think Dante is communicating a pretty straightforward idea, which is that this hellish reality that he's facing he can only handle it with the support of the greatest artist that is his guide through, and you can think of this because it's poetry and because it's meter and it's all very intentional, that it's also the process of reason itself. So that's one part, and so I recognize it's a little bit light on history for a history presentation, so I wanted to go through some of the details. And I have a few copies of the chronology that comes from the beginning of the book, because basically the form of the book is that he traces where Lee Harvey Oswald was throughout, basically from sometime early in 1962. And he takes the record and he sees all of the places in the Soviet Union and Mexico and Louisiana and other places where Lee Harvey Oswald was traveling with passports that were arriving with surprising quickness and various things, very like public events that he was making himself very visibly known at with specific political intentions, specific political ideologies that he was representing. In other words, there's a lot of details that Douglas just simply presents, but the thing that's quite impressive about the book is that it's all interwoven alongside the developments of the world politics that Kennedy is involved in, the relationship that Kennedy is developing with Khrushchev, and you see the simultaneity of all of it. And so you can sort of draw a conclusion for yourself whether or not there's any way to understand it except for there being a very large conspiracy involving the government to stop Kennedy from implementing very specific policies that which would decrease drastically the United States' involvement in imperialist wars, specifically in Vietnam. So that's what I can't cover in the whole presentation, but there's a lot of details that are really fascinating. And just this first entry in the chronology is a good example, which is that, so in 1961, this is where he begins the chronology of his book. Dwight Eisenhower delivers his farewell address, warning the U.S. citizens of the rise in power of the so-called military-industrial complex, the conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry that is new in American experience. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes, is what Eisenhower says. On the same day, Congo leader Patrice Lumumba is assassinated by the Belgian government with the complicity of the CIA. This is according to Douglas's research. This is just from the chronology at the beginning of the book. So 3 days before the presidential inauguration of John F. Kennedy, known for his support of African nationalism. So there's a lot of these kinds of simultaneous events that you can begin to develop a picture. I just give this one as a one-off example. But one that's particularly telling, because I think it wasn't until 2007, if I'm not mistaken, that there was a release of documents by the CIA that actually admitted to the involvement in that particular assassination. So it kind of, and this book was written in 2008. Or I think around. So I think it's helpful in developing a sense of the direct continuity of all of these issues. That the JFK assassination isn't just like something that weird old guys are really worried about or whatever, but that it's actually just history, right? And history, and arguably the most sort of the most essential historical event that occurred in the last century in terms of understanding the fate of the American Republic. But so the chronology that I'm just going to quickly trace out is from the Cuban Missile Crisis to Kennedy's withdrawal. Kennedy's beginning to use the executive function to withdraw from Vietnam. You have direct military confrontation between Soviet and U.S. forces in the form of missiles shooting down reconnaissance planes. There's still a certain degree of diplomatic relations. Kennedy sends a letter accepting the proposal, Khrushchev's proposal, to withdraw the Soviet missiles in return for JFK's pledge not to invade Cuba, but he ignores Khrushchev's demand that the United States remove its missiles from Turkey. And one of the interesting details in this book is there's a lot of documentation on the various back-channel negotiations. So in this particular case, Kennedy is in the State Department. JFK sends Kennedy to meet with the Soviet ambassador, and essentially they're finding ways to circumvent the control over the conditionalities that are largely being enforced through the military's influence. There's a promise given by RFK that the missiles will be removed from Turkey. he appeals for a quick response by Khrushchev, saying many generals are pushing for war and the president may lose control. Khrushchev announces publicly very quickly, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff are evidently quite upset. The next year, in spring of the next year, you have Pope John the 23rd, who is, this is another part of the narrative that Douglas goes through quite in detail that's very interesting, is that Pope John the 23rd was, by this time, actively dying, I believe, of cancer. I believe of cancer, but he's near the end of his life, and he's actively working to broker a peace deal between the Soviets and the Americans, and he issued this at this date, April 11th, is when he issues his encyclical letter, Pacem in Terris, which is a long argument in favor of essentially finding means for peaceful co-development as opposed to continued escalation in war. And it's interesting that an American diplomat who was working in covert means presented an advance copy in Russian of the Pope's encyclical directly to Khrushchev. So it's quite fascinating. Mutual trust and cooperation with an ideological opponent. This is the concept that Douglas says is central to JFK's repentance, and you see it in the peace deal that the Pope is working out between Kennedy and Khrushchev. You can see that Kennedy is writing directly to Khrushchev. They have long personal letters that they exchange, personal feelings, reflections on their own personal lives, where they're discussing openly the issues of law, the issues of the breakdown of rule of law within their own countries, and the challenges that they are facing in trying to maintain peaceful relations. My battery is low. Can I get the charger? Is it reach?
You can switch.
Yeah.
You got it.
So, in the same year, a U.S. negotiator the same day, this man James Donovan returns to Cuba to confer with Castro on the release of Bay of Pigs prisoners, and at the same time, the CIA is attempting, through Donovan as an unwitting agent, to foist a diving suit that has poison in it on Castro to sabotage the peace relations. In the intervening time, you have President Kennedy working directly with Norman Cousins and other people to come up with the concepts, largely inspired by the Pope's encyclical, to use diplomacy to essentially end the Cold War. And on June 10th, Kennedy presents his American University speech, a very famous speech, and quite beautiful, and certainly something that the world needs today. All we have built, all we have worked for would be destroyed in the first 24 hours of nuclear confrontation, and this is something which I think it's hard to imagine how you have people that are still currently threatening these exact same realities on us today, because it seems like after 60 years you would have to have some different understanding. October 11th of that year, Kennedy issues the National Security Memorandum beginning the withdrawal of troops from Vietnam. November 1st of that year, and this is Fletcher Prouty goes through all of this in a way that's very comprehensive in terms of the way that the United States was involved in Vietnam and other imperial powers. But in November 1st of that year, you have a direct threatening of the legitimate government in South Vietnam. so you have these kind of population, these wars that threaten the stability of populations that create the conditions for the so-called necessity of war. And you have a comment made on November 21st by Kennedy after he heard the most recent reporting of the casualties in Vietnam. After I come back from Texas, that's going to change. Vietnam is not worth another American life. And then on November 22nd, you have the assassination, the security having been withdrawn. This is another one of the historical, I mean, Douglas goes through, he personally interviewed lots of different people who were on the Secret Service, and he goes through the whole process of how Secret Service was essentially just quietly withheld in very important ways. The way the motorcade was set up was not the way that it was generally set up in terms of having certain motorcycles and things blocking lines of sight. There was very explicit differences that would have been noted by people who would know those sorts of things. President Kennedy is driven around a dog-leg turn to a virtual stop in Dealey Plaza, Dallas, where sniper teams assassinate him by crossfire. While Fidel Castro and Jean Daniel, who I believe is another one of these ambassadors, are having lunch together, they receive news of Kennedy's death. Castro says, "Everything is changed, everything is going to change." And then, of course, immediately after, you have the arrest of Oswald, and then of particular importance, an armed Jack Ruby is given access to the prisoner, Lee Harvey Oswald. This time, Oswald is brought from the basement to the garage of the police headquarters while being transferred to the Dallas County Jail. You have the camera right there. Ruby runs up, shoots him at the exact time that he's shooting Oswald. A picture is taken. Maybe that's all just a coincidence, but this is another one of the things that Douglas takes pains to reconstruct very thoroughly. And then you see it in contrast to Kennedy's statement on Vietnam from the day before he was assassinated. 2 days later, Johnson tells Henry Cabot Lodge, who's one of the U.S. politicians working in Vietnam at the time, "I am not going to lose Vietnam. I am not going to be the president who saw Southeast China go the way China went." Okay, so I can move somewhat quickly because I'm running out of time. But basically, in order to construct this narrative of the spiritual transformation of Kennedy, it's Douglas points out that there's these certain very beautiful moments in the story where, for example, this one here, where Kennedy has dropped a piece of paper on the ground. He asks his secretary to clean it up. She picks it up, and this is from an account later, and there's a prayer that he's written, which is a famous prayer known to have been cherished by Abraham Lincoln. "I know there is a God, and I see a storm coming. If he has a place for me, I believe that I am ready." And that comes up repeatedly. Kennedy, according to historians, was talking about his own death leading up to the assassination, and particularly the assassination of Lincoln. And so I think you basically have this idea that it's not just that Douglas is reading into Kennedy some idea of a spiritual revelation, but that the evidence is there as well that he was very self-consciously thinking of himself as preparing to sacrifice something for his nation leading up to the assassination. So, just quickly, I want to try to end with one point, which is that you have. I might not be able to get through the whole presentation, but with the association of Lincoln and Kennedy, I feel like you kind of get to the very bottom of hell in the way that Dante puts it, which is that you have the way that Dante puts it is you get to the very bottom of the spiral of hell and you see Satan. He's this giant monster, and he's waist deep in this ice, and he's chewing in his mouth on Judas Iscariot, who is the traitor incarnate, right? And so this idea of both Kennedy and Lincoln being the moral leaders who were betrayed, that I think that is a certain limitation in Douglas's book, where he has a very passionate kind of religious interpretation of Kennedy's character, but he doesn't have any sense of irony about history. So it's all very, very heavy and somber and Catholic in this particular way, where it's kind of he doesn't seem to offer a solution beyond the point of recognizing the reality of evil. But there's when I was looking at Dante's Inferno to try to understand Douglas's reference to it, I came across the way that Dante actually describes Satan sitting at the bottom of hell is very interesting, because I think there's a very intentional irony in the way that Dante presents Satan, and I think that it's something that we can see just by reading the poem. So there's a few lines here, but it shouldn't take too long. So if people are not too bored by it, then we can read this, and then that'll be basically the end.
Yeah, this is it. This is basically the end. This is when they're at the most bottom part of hell, and also the coldest part of hell. This is Satan himself, who is eternally chewing Cassius, the guy who betrayed, not Cassius, I'm sorry, Brutus and Judas Iscariot. So Judas had betrayed Christ, and Judas betrays Christ, Brutus betrays Caesar, so he's eternally chewing him. And since they're at the most bottom part of hell, they've descended all the way down, now they actually have to physically climb Satan himself. So we're here in the middle of the end of the canto where they're actually climbing up Satan.
But I think it'll probably become clear, but Satan is very, very large. He has giant bat wings that are flapping, and he's frozen halfway waist deep in ice.
Yeah. So he's talking about Virgil. He laid fast hold upon the shaggy sides, from fell to fell, descended downward then between the thick hair and the frozen crust. When we were come to where the thigh revolves exactly on the thickness of the haunch, the guide, with labor and with hard-drawn breath, turned round his head where he had his legs, and grappled to the hair as one who mounts, so that to hell I thought we were returning.
Keep fast thy hold, for by such stairs as these,
the master said, panting as one fatigued,
must we perforce depart from so much evil.
Then through the opening of a rock he issued, and down upon the margin seated me. Then towards me he outstretched his weary step. I lifted up mine eyes, and thought to see Lucifer in the same way I had left him. And I beheld him upward hold his legs. And if I then became disquieted, let stolid people think who do not see what the point is beyond which I had passed.
Rise up,
the master said,
upon thy feet. The way is long and difficult the road, and now the sun to Middle Tierce returns.
It was not any palace corridor. There we were, but dungeon natural, with floor uneven and unease of light, air from the abyss. Air from the abyss, I tear myself away, my master, said I when I had arisen. To draw me from an error, speak a little. Where is the ice? And how is this one fixed thus upside down? And how in such short time from eve to morn has the sun made his transit? And he to me,
Thou still imaginest thou art beyond the center, where I grasped the hair of the fell worm who mines the world. That side thou wast, so long as I descended. When round I turned me, thou didst pass the point to which things heavy draw from every side. And now, beneath the hemisphere, art come opposite that which overhangs the vast dry land, and neath whose cope was put to death the man who without sin was born and lived.
The guide and I into that hidden road now entered to return to the bright world. And without care of having any rest, we mounted up, he first and I the second, till I beheld through a round aperture some of the beauteous things that heaven doth bear. Thence we came forth to re-behold the stars.
So the reason why I brought that in is because I thought, okay, so you have this book, JFK and the Unspeakable. If you read it, 600 pages, might take you a month or something like that. You're basically going into this very hellish space in your mind, but the author intentionally poses it so that you have this concept of redemption that might draw you through the story and provide a certain meaning to Kennedy's death and to the meaning that might have for you. But it is nevertheless, I would argue, a quite depressing book because it doesn't really provide very many solutions with regard to how to actually recognize this evil in the world, because he calls it the unspeakable. Because I think Merton, did have a very real spiritual insight into what's happening, but he, through his own kind of religiosity, said that you couldn't speak about it. And so it's this weird thing where, yeah, I know, but we have the room till 9:30. But basically, the point is that what you have with Dante is you have an irony at the critical point, the encounter with Satan, where simply by progressing along the path appointed by love, according to the poem, in other words, by pursuing what you had to do according to love, a sense of divine love, Satan ends up not being this giant monster with flapping wings chewing on evil traitors from world history, but is actually this giant, ridiculous a pair of legs sticking into the sky that has no use or even any agency or meaning or anything. And where I wanted to take it was with this kind of concept that our organization and Diane's campaign has been focusing on a lot lately. I think that you could basically call this like Satan, but with its legs up in the air. Because, yeah, you have the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned of, and then with the Kennedy assassination and the cover-up from the middle of the 60s throughout the 70s, when the LaRouche organization started and has been working ever since, the society allowed these things to develop more and more. Politically, it was never, the problems were never really addressed politically. So now Ray McGovern calls it the Mickey Mat. Military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia. This corruption has become it's infested all parts of the society. But if you just call it the unspeakable and say there's some evil everywhere in the world, then you'll just say that it's evil. But if you have a certain degree of irony, which was communicated to me by one of the organizers I was working with, he called it the military post-industrial complex. If you can have a certain degree of irony, then you can recognize that where this is all coming from is from the bankruptcy of evil. And I think that the principle that Helga Zepp-LaRouche has, that evil is only the result of a lack of development, fits very well with this. And so with that, I'll leave it.
Okay, great. Thank you. I wanted to just add something else from Lynn's paper, which gets at this from another angle. The last section of the How Bertrand Russell Became an Evil Man is called The Coming Age of Humanity. And Lynn writes, one cannot learn the principles which shape history from only the facts of the immediate social relations personally experienced within the span of a single person's lifetime. Many have proposed to premise alleged principles upon just that limited experience. Inevitably, what they propose always turns out to be utopian rubbish or worse. He says, alas, we live on a planet peopled largely with Don Quixotes and Sancho Panzas. Most persons dwell either in the mists of some academic or related sort of ideological fantasy, like Cervantes' Don Quixote, or they are so busy with their personal pleasures and family affairs that, quote, I have no time to waste on history, unquote. The Don Quixote is willing to govern society, but governs it madly. The more numerous Sancho Panzas cannot rule society because they can't even govern themselves. Until we can bring mankind into the age of reason, which we might wish were the coming age of humanity, history will be shaped in actuality not by the wills of masses of humanity, but by the mere handfuls who, for purposes of good or evil, steer the fate of mankind generally, as herds of cows are steered to and from the pasture and occasionally also to the slaughterhouse. So here's the question: how do we get our friends to not behave like herds of cattle? And I think this is partly what you're getting at, in also recognizing the shortcomings of Douglas's work. He identifies the evil, and I appreciate that he identifies it not in a literal empirical sense, really. I mean, he identifies the footprints of something that seems really evil with this chronology. But how do you solve it? And I think really there has to be a renaissance, but how do you get there? There has to be a transformation of people's internal sense of identity and potential, and the recognition that what we're striving for is a process of perfection, self-perfection of the human species, that none of us is going to attain perfection while we are here in this physical domain, but that doesn't prevent us from having a conception of perfection in mind. And similarly, mankind can continue in that direction. That's Helga's 10th principle. So I know you may have other thoughts. I just wanted quickly to ask Dave to show the legislation to address what you were getting at about the military financial complex, because our friends at the LaRouche organization have drafted an act, from Swords to Plowshares Act of 2024, making the point that since 2001, basically, the United States has spent over $17 trillion on our military budget. We have spent more than the next 10 countries all added up together. But the great irony is we haven't become more productive. Russia, with a defense budget which is a fraction of ours, is vastly outproducing what we're able to produce. Biden said we had to send cluster munitions to Ukraine because we'd run out of 155 millimeter shells, or we couldn't produce them quickly enough. And now there seems to be a trade-off between arming Israel and arming Ukraine. But the point is, all of this is complete madness, which will lead to the self-annihilation of the human race. And actually, what needs to be done is a corporation created that takes the companies where the actual physical capability is, which is not BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, the people who are the stockholders, but Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin. People can think of others. There are many of them. British Aerospace. Unfortunately, it's a British company, but they've got a lot of plants, including one in Binghamton, New York, which was fought for by my opponent, Kirsten Gillibrand, since her father-in-law was one of the top executives of that company. But these companies can all produce other things. So how do we get this done, and what should be produced? And I also bring this up because Lynn, we had the other day a short quote from Lynn on this question of redemption. Who are you angry at? And it doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue people like Jamie Dimon or Larry Fink for crimes, but are they really the cause of the evil? And Lynn referenced the quote, which people are familiar with, that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and spiritual wickedness in high places. What does that mean? It means that you're not going to solve the problem by targeting a particular individual, a particular human, but by actually causing people to change the way they think, or inspiring people, because you can't cause people. And that's also the mistake of our enemies. They think you can force people, either through brute physical force or through terror, but that's not how the human mind works. So the question is to inspire people to have a changed identity. And I think that's really what has to be done. That's the point of my candidacy, is to change the nation, to change the American people, such that we might finally get a president that is worthy of the identity and legacy of the United States of America. Unfortunately, so far, we have had presidents who are reflective of the general state of the cultural malaise of the population. So those are my thoughts. I would urge people to go to the LaRouche organization or thelarouche.org and get that legislation and start moving on it. But Robert or Jose or other people there, if you have some thoughts that you want to say in conclusion, or we can take a couple questions or whatever you have.
Yeah, I mean, if there are questions, we can definitely take them. If not, I could just end with one quote from a Schiller essay, which I think is useful in identifying, at least, I mean, I think that it's the question for me really became, how did Dante have this ironic insight of how to poetically compose the moment where you bridge the gap from hell towards the place where you can then again see the stars. And I've recently been reading this essay by Friedrich Schiller called On the Sublime. It was written in 1801, which is, I mean, interesting to think of in relation to the chronology of the Revolutionary War. But he gives a very coherent, a very clear picture of this. He gives this concept of the sublime is not vague in any way in the way that he presents it. And if I just read this one paragraph, the feeling of the sublime is a mixed feeling. It is a combination of a state of woe, which expresses itself in its highest degree as a shudder, and a state of joy, which can increase to ecstasy, and although it is not exactly pleasure, is greatly preferred by fine souls to all other pleasures. This union of two contradictory feelings into a single emotion irrefutably proves our moral independence. Since it is absolutely impossible that the same object would exist in two different relationships to us, it follows that we ourselves stand in two opposite relationships to the object. Two opposing natures must be united in us, consequently, which are interested in the idea of the same object in entirely opposite ways. Therefore, with the feeling of the sublime, we experience that our state of mind does not necessarily conform to the state of our senses, that the laws of nature are not necessarily our laws, and that we have a self-dependent principle in us which is independent of all sensuous emotions. And the whole essay is that sort of densely worded, but I think that what he gets at there is very comprehensible to anybody who is actually thinking about the reality of what's happening in Gaza right now and also in Ukraine in a way that isn't fully given over to despair. Because if you think about the current developments and recognize in them some kind of necessary doom or nothing other than the symptoms of an inevitable collapse of an empire or something like that, then you would just have maybe woe and you wouldn't have any cause for joy. But if nevertheless you are somehow still seeking in a human way to experience or to discover the possibility for some form of joy in your own life, it is bound up with the reality of the woe that we are all facing with the developments that are happening in the world. And I think particularly with regard to at any rate, I don't know how to explain it except for to say that that if you have a moment where you recognize that things are worse than you ever could have possibly imagined it when you were, say, 8 years old, and yet nonetheless life is still something that you are glad to have, to me that is what Schiller is talking about, is this confluence of seemingly contradictory feelings simultaneously, and the discovery in that moment of the complexity and the independence of the human spirit from merely the sensuous feelings that we have that are passing. So it's an argument against depression for all the 20-year-olds.
Yeah. Is this something you had mentioned? Schiller says history is sublime. Is that what you mean by that? That you see the bad and you still see the beauty in history as the truth?
Yeah, it's in the same essay where he says that history is a sublime object. And it's to the extent that history reveals the individual's absolute freedom, but simultaneously it's being subject to necessity, if I remember that correctly. And that again, that sort of apparent contradiction is he says that's in this sense only do I think of history as a sublime object.
Or alignments in the best of all worlds.
Mm-hmm.
Any questions?
Okay. I mean, isn't the source of hope basically that other countries will defeat these institutions?
Just to restate that, isn't the source of hope that other countries will defeat these institutions? Diane or Robert?
I could hear that, and that's, I mean, yeah, that's certainly hopeful. But I think that our optimism actually doesn't come from outside, it comes from inside. That is, what makes one optimistic is the faith in one's own determination to never stop fighting no matter what. Because you will see people who are pessimistic in the face of everything, but I think the pessimism comes from their choice to stop fighting. They choose to stop fighting and then they become pessimistic. So there is reason to be hopeful. I mean, clearly what these nations of the BRICS and BRICS Plus are doing is creating a very serious problem for these evil bastards. I don't know if we will be fortunate enough that they can just succeed without the United States changing, if the United States will just quietly disintegrate and become a broken down rubble heap of impoverished, nasty people and become irrelevant as we are becoming. I'm not sure these people will allow that. I think they might unleash something really horrible or just really sadistic, perverse, nasty, very ugly events like the terror attack on the memorial for Soleimani, the Iranian general who was killed on orders of Donald Trump under the influence of Mike Pompeo, but Trump was never wise enough to regret it. He still brags about it. This was a terrible violation of international law, a great affront, violation of the sovereignty of Iran. So somehow there's a memorial 4 years later, and 2 bombs go off and kill over 100 people and injure many others. What's the purpose of that except just nastiness and terror and designed to provoke other kinds of reactions? Similarly, the Ukrainian shelling, which has been ongoing now they didn't just stop. They're still shelling Belgorod, a Russian city on the border. They killed 25 people so far that I know of, shelling an ice skating rink and a shopping mall. So we have to make sure that we stop this. And those of us in the United States have a great deal of responsibility. You can't sit back and say, well, because we have censorship and because the elections are stolen, I couldn't really stop my government from doing this. That's not what it says in our Constitution. These people are required to represent us, but they don't represent us if we don't go there, go to their offices, get in the streets, and run for office against them and challenge them. And I think if more people were active and more active, they would be more optimistic. And then we would also be more bold and hilarious and outrageous in some of the actions that we're taking, and come up with a lot of humor and jokes that could get people, perhaps could shatter the terror that these evil perpetrators seek to impose. So I think we should wrap up because I know there's literature, there's people there in the room in New York, and there are things to discuss there in the way of activities, et cetera. I would like to say to everyone there and everyone who's listening online, as you know, as I've been discussing, since there is not currently, certainly not a qualified incumbent president, and there's no qualified presidential candidate opposition, my campaign must be deployed as a national campaign, even though I'm running for U.S. Senate. And that means chapters in every state. If you're watching from another state and you want to volunteer or get active with people in your state, please email at sareforsenate.com. If you are in the state of New York and you want to be active in your county or head up a county organization with the campaign, and we should take this legislation from swords to plowshares and move on that like crazy. It's a beautiful intervention point. So same thing, please email sareforsenate.com. Let us know. For leaders and activists of these chapters, there will be a Zoom call on Sunday at 5:30 where we're going to be discussing it. And as always, if you have not been able to donate your legal limit to the campaign of $3,300, please work on narrowing the gap between what you've given. The campaign needs funds to print, mail literature, et cetera. So I want to thank you, Robert, very much for the presentation, Jose, and thank you everyone for coming. And if we are lucky and do our work, hopefully we'll be able to meet again next week.
Okay.